Hello, I'm Adam,
And I'm Adrian.
and welcome to Cast from the Crypt. Today we are talking about Soylent Green. Just like our last movie, it also came out in 1973.
But what makes this interesting is it takes place in the year 2022.
Yeah, it's
So
here.
it's here. How does the movie stack up to reality? Not well. The world is nothing like this.
Well, no, it isn't. But pretend it's 1973. You think the world will one day look like this. What is 2022 to you? That's so far in the future. You can't even imagine what it's like. So maybe it's not like this in 2022, but who's to say 2122 it's not like this,
Well,
or
that's more
beyond.
likely. That is more likely.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so this movie, as Adam just pointed out, came out in 1973. It actually was released to some critical acclaim. It's loosely based off of a novel from the 60s called Make Room, Make Room. But the adaptation, the film itself, ended up winning several awards, including a Nebula Award and a Saturn Award, which are both specifically geared towards science fiction films. And I understand why. This was an interesting movie. It's unlike anything else we've covered in that I not that we haven't covered serious movies or attempts at serious movies, but this is a serious attempt at depicting a dystopian future, right? And a dystopian future grounded in real issues like pollution and climate change and overpopulation, food shortages, etc. Right? It's not some alien invasion movie, right? It's actually very critical of things like corporations and the effects that they have on the planet. So that's what I think separates this movie from a lot of the things that we've covered in the past.
Yeah. This movie, I think, aged beautifully. It brings up a lot of issues that you would not have seen covered at the time but are incredibly relevant now, like you said, with like overpopulation and climate change. And I think the world building that this movie does is my favorite part about it easily. The plot could go nowhere. It could have the worst plot in the world, and I'd still love this movie just because of the feel for the dystopia that you get. And it's really, really bleak.
Yeah, no, that's honestly the word I would use to describe this movie, bleak. There is no it actually it made me laugh while watching it because this is not nowadays very original, right? Oftentimes when we depict the far future, it is dystopian. And I think that's because of our generation and the millennial generations, like, I guess, nihilism about the direction that the planet's headed, or I guess you want to call it their realistic expectations for what's ahead. Not to sound too negative, but that's what made the movie Her and its really positive and interesting depiction of the future so refreshing when it came out. And while I was watching this, even though it's so much of what I've seen in the genre before, this movie very much trailblazed the things that we see now. I've heard about this movie quite a bit. And what's funny is the first time I ever heard about it, I heard about it because there's a like meal replacement drink that you can buy at Walgreens, HEB, whatever, called Soylent. And some old dude was like, "Oh, Soylent Green. Why would you ever drink that?" I had no idea what he was talking about. Come to find out,
Yeah, well, yeah.
yeah, the product
in
is yeah,
preemptive
uh,
warning, bomb drop, but go ahead.
right. I come to find out that the product is named after a movie in which they are eating people.
Surely it's
Um,
not named after that.
it is. It is.
That's
Yeah, it's on their
it's a
website.
weird marketing scheme.
You know, though, I like the product, which brings us to our sponsorship,
Soylent
Soylent.
Green. Tuesday is Green Day.
Yeah. But what you said about the world building, it is really good. That's one of my favorite parts of this movie. And I feel like they do it, the world building, I mean, really subtly. Like you don't see much of the world, and yet they paint such a clear and vivid picture of the world that we are living in during this 97-minute runtime, right?
Yeah, you get a really good feeling like you're there. I
Yeah.
guess I'll describe it a little bit. Some of my favorite aspects. So the year is 2022, of course. The population of New York City is 40 million people, and unemployment rate is at 50%. So 20 million of those 40 million are homeless, and it feels like 20 million people are homeless in this movie. The government has more or less been relegated to just a crowd control operation. It's all about hurting people. They've enforced a curfew at a certain point, so everybody has to get out of the street. So they go inside of any building that they can find and they sleep on the floor, on the staircases, shoulder to shoulder, like a colony of bats. And it is incredible how overcrowded and overwhelming these scenes look. They must have hired so many just extras. I couldn't even imagine coordinating this many people. There's so many times we see our main character, who I will introduce now. Is a detective named Robert Thorne, played by Charlton Heston of the Planet of the Apes fame. Yeah, there's scenes of him like having to step, like he'll use like the railing of a staircase, kind of to like lift himself up through the staircase because you have to. There's nowhere to even step because there's so many people littering the ground trying to sleep. Uh, and the ambient noise is really good too in all these scenes. It's just coughing, snoring, sneezing. They never really touch on disease in this movie, but you get a real sense of like everyone is always sick because everybody's way too close together and everybody's malnourished. The drinking
Yeah.
water isn't good. Living conditions are really terrible. I don't know. This sense of overwhelming poverty is like the strongest feeling I think you get from this movie. And as depressing as it is, it's very well done.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I think they set the tone really well. That shot that you mentioned in the first 10 minutes of the movie where he's trying to leave the apartment and there's just people all over that staircase. And they repeat that shot like twice more, I think, when he's going back home. But the tone is set and you just get the sense that the the world is no longer comfortable for a majority of the people that live there anymore, right? Um, and that's because, and that's how the movie kind of introduces the oligarchical nature of at least America in this world that they are creating. Oh, so the main premise in this movie, or what essentially the hook here is that we have this NYPD detective, Detective Thorne, and he has to investigate a murder of a very, very wealthy man who was a board member of this all encompassing, very powerful corporation called the Soylent Corporation. And the Soylent Corporation is really the only place where the masses can get their food, right? They supply food for like half of the world. And they sell this like essentially cracker wafer that doesn't really have much variety. They have three varieties called Soylent Red, Soylent Yellow, and of course, Soylent Green. And that's the most nutritious one that they source apparently from plankton. But the Soylent Corporation in this movie is incredibly, incredibly important. So, of course, Detective Thorne having to investigate this board member's brutal murder is incredibly important. The stakes are very high.
Yeah, and this is a really good way that the movie marries all the issues of this world together. Of course, just as in real life, nothing exists in a vacuum. The Soylent Corporation is so rich and powerful because they control all the food. They are the way people get food, and their all-encompassing nature also helps you get a sense for how important food has become. Food is the most valuable resource at this point in the world that this movie is set in, and
Right.
that is something that it keeps coming back to. At a certain point, the characters get their hands on real food, and it's a lot of it is just fruit. They get beef at one point, and they've never had this food before, and they're amazed at what real food tastes like. They have are protein wafers, protein cubes. That isn't real food. And these two characters, mind you, are better off than most. I say these two characters. I'm getting ahead of myself. So Robert Thorne, NYPD detective, lives with Saul Roth, who's an older gentleman. He works with Thorne to help his investigations. He'll like look through records, and they live in this apartment. That's why we see him going through all these people sleeping in a hallway, is so he can go into his apartment. And this is where we're introduced to how he lives. He is one of the lucky half of people who has a job, and that is why he is able to afford his comparatively well off living arrangement. They live in a singular room that's sectioned off by sheets that work as kind of a faux barrier that allows them to sleep separately and cook separately from where they sleep. We find out that all the lights are kept on with an electric bicycle that they're hooked up to that they have to pedal every so often. And we get a good sense for like how our characters live. Saul is he's so old that he can remember certain things. He remembers food. He remembers trees. He's like Betty White in the Lorax. But Robert Thorne is not as old, and he basically doesn't know what he's missing. And Saul tells him that all the time, and so he's less nihilistic. Saul, as old as he is kind of given up. Is in the process of giving up on the world. Things his whole life have just gotten worse and worse and worse, and now he's an old man. The life expectancy in this society cannot be very high, and at this point, I think he feels like he has no purpose in the world anymore. So after we've seen all of this poverty, we get a shot of suddenly we're in a really fancy flat, and there's a rich sort of looking gentleman and a young girl he's with. He's sort of older. And so
I
this
know
is,
you're
of
talking
course,
about.
Simonson, the board member we were talking about. We see a man break into this fancy, fancy establishment, this building. And yes, Simonson
Yeah.
talks to his soon to be assassin as if he knows this was coming, and he's completely resigned to it. And he is, of course, murdered. This man kills him with a crowbar. And this is the inciting incident. This is the case that Thorne is investigating for the whole of the movie.
Yeah. So, one of the first characters that we meet that isn't Saul uh, or Detective Thorne is, of course, Cheryl. And Cheryl lives with and happened to witness the murder of Simonson. So, of course, Detective Thorne is incredibly invested in what she can provide. Now, what's interesting about Cheryl as a character is she is what the movie calls a concubine, but also what we know about this world, and what I think is really interesting to note, because they do such a great job of kind of showing the differences in the classes here. You have what is a very, very high class, and then literally everybody else. And in the very, very high class, like the folks that work for the Soylent Corporation, they have these tenants that live with them that they call concubines, but also furniture, and they just keep them in the apartment to make the place look nicer because it's the homes of these very, very old men, and so they have just beautiful women sitting around at all times. Um, right off the bat, you get the sense that Detective Thorne is interested in Cheryl uh, outside of her role in this investigation, right? And you kind of get the sense that Cheryl is interested in him too, right off the bat. Now, for me, I don't know about you, his whole thing with women in this movie was the most obnoxious part. Like, Charlton Heston, as much as I like him in this movie, I think he's actually very good in this movie, is not charming enough to justify just how quickly the women in this movie are drawn to him. And there's two specific instances that I can recall where I was just like, that was the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, and especially Charlton Heston in this movie, where he's supposed to be absolutely grimy, you know?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, he's gross, right? He probably doesn't have showers often.
yeah, for these women that live better lives, I suppose I don't see what the attraction would be. But I think the role of women in this movie is very interesting. So, like you said, he had this innate attraction to her, but he had more than just an innate attraction to her. He was immediately just amazed by everything in this absolutely rich apartment.
Yeah, that's
He
true.
starts walking around. He grabs a pillowcase and just starts filling it with things he finds. He gets bourbon, some apples, some beef. This is where he gets the food for that scene uh, where they're eating real food I mentioned earlier. And one of the things in that apartment is this woman, this piece of furniture. And I think, in a way, she's another one of these lavish luxuries that he can't help but immediately be like a starved dog and gravitate towards. And her job is to please men. You know, they have a few women like this in the movie that serve this role that's like somewhere between a mail order bride and a prostitute. She talks about how like now that her past tenant is dead, she has to worry about the next one wanting her because she comes with the apartment because she's literally a piece of furniture. Um, but all these women live these lives and live this way because that's how you live comfortably. That's how you get fed. That's how you get clothed. And those are things that most other people don't have the benefit of. So,
Right. Like at the very least, they are sleeping in beds with AC, you know? Um, yeah, and again, it really speaks to the world building that you were praising because it just shows how dire it is that these women put themselves in this situation just to just to have basic necessities, right? But Cheryl quickly proves that she is not just a piece of furniture, um, and she actually really helps Detective Thorne with his investigation. Um, she opens up a huge door for him and gives him quite the lead that ultimately leads him to Simonson's priest, who just before Simonson's murder had heard a an interesting confession. Uh, And this is, I think, when the movie starts to really move at a quicker pace, right? Before this, we're sort of slowly being exposed to the different levels, the layers to this world. But as soon as the investigation starts to take off and more murder happens and this plot starts to wind, uh, the movie picks up quite a bit.
Yeah, this plot is relatively simple. If they wanted to just quickly show the plot points and then have the movie in, this movie would not be that long. And it's not that long already. It's an hour and 36 minutes, which nobody
Right.
can complain about. They managed to do so much in such a little amount of time. It's paced really well. Uh, but this plot is, like I said, simple because not all the movie is following this plot. A lot of it is the world building.
So Detective Thorne knows that there was a particularly sensitive confessional held by this priest for Simonson just before his death. And Detective Thorne does his best to get out of the priest the sensitive information that would help with the investigation, to tell him why was this bigwig killed, right? For what purpose? So Thorne is able to, I guess, some pieces out of the priest, but ultimately, because of the sanctity of a confessional, the priest can't give Thorne any real information to progress through the investigation. And this ultimately leads to the governor, who is like the higher entity here that is able to say yay or nay on progressing the investigation. They try to shut it on Thorne. They want to end his investigation. And this is concerning to him because he knows that he is expendable, right? He needs this case, A, because he feels like he can do it, but B, because he knows that he needs to stay relevant and that he wants to catch a big one, essentially, which is a pretty classic angle in most detective films. And it's not something that I was anticipating from this movie. When I had heard about this movie, I was expecting more Mad Max and less winding detective film. But I was pleasantly surprised by what I got.
Yeah, I really like it. I mean, it really does take that like typical noir detective film and put a very interesting dystopian sci-fi spin on it. It's something you haven't seen before, and I don't think anything I've seen since. Apart from maybe like you could draw similarities between this and Blade Runner, but
Yeah. Yeah, you could.
yeah,
That's a good point.
yeah. During all this, we just keep getting more scenes of the world. We are finding out that the Soylent products are in shorter supply. There's less food, and so Thorn gets assigned to riot control duty, more or less as a punishment for not letting this case go. And we see the market where people buy food. They stand in line for hours upon hours to be distributed a small portion of rationings, and there are riot control officers everywhere. There's right before they run completely out of food, uh, Thorne talks to the guy that's about to announce it, and he's talking about how he is trying to build up the nerve to inform the crowd because he knows once he does, all these people are going to go crazy. They're starving, they're not getting enough food as it is, and now they're going to be told that there's no food left for them. And when he announces that, he says, "The scoops are coming soon. Please disperse." And they immediately start rioting, start destroying the market. And then the scoops come in.
I love the
The
scoops.
scoops are great. They're just tractors.
They're
And
tractors with like big shovels.
yeah, and they just, or no, they're like dump trucks too with big shovels at the front. They just start
Yeah.
scooping people up and dumping them in the back of these trucks. Who knows where they take them to? They probably just take them like away from there and dump them somewhere. But it's a very effective way to break up this crowd. But people are also getting trampled and run over. And during the chaos of this scene, an assassination attempt is made on Thorn, some random dude with a gun that we as the audience know was sent by the governor Santini and the Soylent Corporation to keep Thorn quiet about whatever Simons was involved in.
You also gather that this is the same guy that killed Simonson. But the attempt obviously doesn't work because the movie continues to run for like 40 minutes after this. Um, but in a really, really fun death, the attempted killer is crushed by one of the scoops. He's like completely crushed by the shovel, which is fun.
And it's pretty dramatic. He like looks
Yeah.
up and sees it descending and like screams and then is crushed. It's very dramatic. I think they're just giving these random people who are desperate orders to assassinate people, and they're doing it for the absolute necessity of the money or whatever they get out of working for these corporations and committing these acts. But one thing I'd like to talk about in these scenes where there's an assassination attempt, and there's a few scenes like this, a few assassination attempts, if you will, or fight scenes that are in public. Anytime there's violence in public, a bunch of people around Thorn and the assailants die. Innately, initially, the assassin shoots at Thorn and hits a woman in the head. Uh, Thorn starts running at him, try to make his way through the crowd, and he fires again and kills another man. Wild shots are just being fired at each other, and every bullet is hitting someone. So many just
Yeah.
bystanders die in multiple fight scenes in this movie that it really helps add to that feeling of people are expendable, and there's so many people that a human life is worth so much less than what we ethically want to assign value to.
Absolutely. And they double down on you know, this depiction of the world shortly after this scene, specifically the scene with the riot, because we see that Saul is at the apartment also investigating what Detective Thorne is on. He's curious. He's trying to help him out. He's on the same case. It should be noted that Saul was a college professor and he was also an analyst. He did analytics for the police. But he starts going through these books that were pulled by Thorne from the crime scene, Simonson's apartment. Um, and he starts to analyze them. And he finds that not only is the planet under extreme distress, but that the oceans are quite literally dying, and that there isn't uh, enough plankton to produce this new, very, very popular, very nutritious Soylent Green formula. And as I mentioned before, Soylent Green is so nutritious because supposedly it's being made from plankton, which is one of the last things that they can source their food from. But of course, if the oceans are dying and there is no plankton, it begs the question, how are they making Soylent Green? But we saw in the scene before that people, the masses, are catching wind that there is even a shortage of this, the only food source that they have. Um, would you call this the climax of the movie?
I definitely would. Um,
Yeah.
Saul, who's already, like we've seen, getting more and more jaded as the movie goes by, he's giving up. He's so horrified at what the implications of this are that he goes to a suicide center, which is another new aspect of this dystopia that we're introduced to. They don't explain it, they just show you what it is, and they do a great job of show, not tell here. But basically, what it is the government has set up suicide centers. There's so many people that assisted suicide has become a social service because they need to make room. If you don't want to live, then well, then die because lots of people want to live and they're starving to death as it is.
Right.
And the people that you see waiting in line at this suicide center, they look old. Some of them have canes or crutches. Maybe they're like handicapped in some way. They're at a disadvantage for competing in this world, and they're all done with it, I guess. We see Saul gets to choose a color. He gets to choose some music. And then they take him to this back room. They give him a drink. And then they show him a movie that is just scenes of nature in a room that is the color that he chose with the music he chose, which he chooses some classical music. Meanwhile, Thorn gets back to their apartment and sees a note left by Saul and so he runs out of the apartment and starts running to the suicide center. He wants to catch Saul just before he dies. And he manages to. He gets there just in the nick of time. He has to muscle his way through the orderlies to get back to Saul's room. And they have a very emotional exchange. Thorn gets there just as the movie's playing, and he sees these scenes of nature that he's never seen before. And I think, to use his words, he says, how could he have known? Like, how could he have imagined? I think is what he says.
Right.
And right as he's seeing these gorgeous things he's never seen before, his best friend is dying because he can't live in the horrors of the world anymore. And it's a very emotional exchange, and I think it's very well acted. I sometimes am hard on Charlton Heston, but I think this is his best acting is in this movie.
Yeah, I think this or Planet of the Apes, and even that's a bit over the top for me. Um, but I love the juxtaposition in worldview between these two guys in this moment. Like, Saul dying in the comfort of things that he used to know, and Thorn holding his friend, seeing what the world was that he never got a chance to witness. Honestly, you got to watch the scene because it is by far, I think, my favorite scene in the whole movie. Um, I like the closing scene too, but it's a really special, somber moment. But it's also kind of beautiful. I don't know. They did a really good job in this sequence, and of course, I think we got mildly ahead of ourselves because although we've mentioned it briefly before, what Saul finds that put him in such distress that made him finally decide that he wanted to leave the world forever was the discovery that Soylent Green is being made out of dead people, but also prisoners, or people that are taken into custody.
Yeah. Well, the movie doesn't reveal that by this point.
No, no, but that's what makes him. Oh, he also whispers it to him.
Yeah. But we, as
Yeah,
the
and
audience, don't catch that until
no,
they reveal it later in the movie.
no, they guard it really well.
Which, at this point, is so not guarded well. A lot of people haven't heard of this movie. But if you have heard of the movie, it's because you've heard that absolutely iconic, famous line from the end of this movie where
Yeah,
Charlton Heston is yelling Soylent Green is people. So if you've heard of this movie, it's been spoiled for you. So,
right,
but
right.
within the movie, they do a good job of guarding it.
Yeah, I'm sure in 1973 the reveal was mind blowing.
Yeah. If you don't know,
Right.
if you did know, then yeah.
It makes it makes the reveal of the like nutrition loaf in Snowpiercer seem so milk toast, doesn't it?
Oh, that's exactly what I thought when I first watched Snowpiercer. I was like, whatever. I was
Yeah,
like,
it's
have you
not
seen
Soylent
Soylent Green?
Green.
Yeah, it's not people.
Yeah,
Yeah, but this scene adds to the world building too. Like these scenes of nature, you can assume do not exist at this point in the world. Um,
Oh,
a-
right.
Another aspect of the poor living conditions that you see more than they really talk about is everybody is sweating. Thorn carries around a dirty piece of cloth he ties around his neck to wipe his face, wipe the sweat off his face, because it's so hot always. Because the greenhouse effect has burnt the city to a crisp. The world is hot. The winters don't get cold. And this is the world Saul remembers. He remembers a winter. He remembers deer and trees. And so it makes his final words in his suicide note that much more profound. He writes, I'm returning home. He's returning home to a world that does not exist, to a dead world. Uh, and that adds to the emotional weight of this scene. Like, the best way to describe that scene is emotional. Like, it really does a
Yeah.
good job. It's very impactful, very effective.
Yeah. I would agree. And you're critical of Charlton Heston. I'm overall critical of the 70s for films made in the 70s for their acting, but this is a tight sequence. I mean, it really holds up.
Yeah, it took me aback, honestly. I wasn't
Hmm.
expecting such good acting, but yeah, it. No wonder it was nominated for all these awards.
Yeah, for sure.
Um, well, I guess after this, we don't get a lot of dialogue. Saul dies, and he whispered something to Thorn that we, of course, as the audience, didn't hear. And so Thorn more or less follows his body. They take the bodies away. Anytime someone dies in this movie, a government, you know, people show up and take the body off somewhere, and you don't know where.
Yeah.
In these white painted garbage trucks, basically. And Thorn follows the truck. He sneaks onto the top of one of the trucks and sneaks into the plant that they take the bodies. And he follows the bodies. They dump them into this pool. He runs through the whole plant, sneaking around. And at the end of the plant is where he finds a conveyor belt shooting out Soylent Green to be packaged and sent out to the masses. So at this point, you probably can put two and two together. You understand what's happening, even if you haven't seen any of the spoilers for this movie before.
Right.
Uh, but he gets caught and he runs away. He's got to find a way to tell people the horrible news. And that's when a group of assassins start chasing him through the streets. He manages to put a call in to get some backup from the police, but it's honestly too late. Men with guns are chasing him, and we get to the that grand finale. Would you like to talk about it?
Yeah. So he's actively being chased, actively being shot at, and he's able to duck away in a church. Uh and at this point, yeah, so what's interesting, right, is that this whole movie, everybody is, even the police officers are in such just they live so poorly that it really feels like he is just a common man, even though he is a government employee. He is a detective, right? He is the law, but you get this sense that the forces in charge of the world, this corporation, is such a massive and um, powerful adversary, right? Like, even though he is a detective, he is such a hero archetype. He is still so weak. Um, so that, I guess that's why it was weird to me that he ended up having a gun at all. I don't know, but he finds refuge in a church. He is able to kill his attackers. He's able to actually win in a gunfight, but he does get shot, and he is horribly, horribly hurt. It's clear that even though he's getting medical attention, because paramedics do take care of him, it's looking bad, and you're watching him get worse and worse in just a matter of seconds. But as he's being pulled away, carried by the paramedics, a crowd starts to circle around him, and he reaches his arm up, probably with his last few dying breaths, and he yells out, Soylent Green is people. Soylent Green is people. And then there's this, I don't know if it's hilarious or chilling, that final shot where they like isolate his arm and they zoom in on his arm and then they cut to a poppy field, a field of red poppies, seemingly indicating that, I don't know, he's one with nature now or something. I didn't know what they wanted me to think. All I know is that it made me think a variety of things. But of course, the part that people watch this movie for is that final scene, that final moment, those last seconds of the movie where Charlton Heston yells out to the masses, Soylent Green is people. It was great.
Yeah, he does that in a church that's overcrowded with people sleeping in it.
Right.
it. The ending, though, kind of left me thinking, well, what now? And that adds yet another layer to the bleakness of the situation, of the place this world is in. So everybody knows Soylent Green is people. What now? They don't have any food already. There's a shortage of Soylent Green. There's no plankton. What else are they gonna eat? They
Yeah.
are still gonna be forced to eat it. Maybe it'd be better off if no one knew what they were eating.
Because they need to eat.
Yeah. So
Yeah. It's rough.
even though he
It's,
in a way like succeeds and gets the news out to people, like the hopelessness of this world even robs you of that victory.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely it does. Um, I don't know. I really love the ending. I thought it was corny and very 1973 Charlton Heston, but everything about it, him reaching out in desperation, actively dying, yelling out that phrase, the crowd surrounding him, and then that weird final shot of his arm reaching out, and then they, again, isolate his arm and then transition. They cut to a poppy field showing poppies kind of reaching out to the sun, in a meadow. It was weird, right? I mean, it felt out of place, and yet I can't stop thinking about it.
Yeah, the poppy field they cut to too. It's the footage from earlier that we saw in
Right,
the
in the
like
euthanasia
suicide
center.
room. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I love the ending of this movie. I think that this movie really picks up after the riot. For me, that's when I was actually more interested because the beginning, personally, I found to drag. Um,
I don't know. I quite like the beginning. I love just exploring this world, and that's what we do a lot of in this movie. And that's what it does best. That's why I like it so much. My biggest complaint, I think the thing that is done the worst in this movie is all the fight scenes. Did you notice that?
yeah,
Like the
yeah,
blocking is bad.
yeah. The combat's not very well done. Um, and like any like punch noise or anything is just ridiculous. But I think that just comes with the era, you know.
Yeah. No, I agree
I think
too.
action has gotten better overall. Um, but personally, I understand the praise for the world building, and I agree with it. But what I wasn't expecting was for this to be such a sort of isolated detective story. I kind of texted you this after watching the movie. Um, I was expecting a more sweeping look at the world. But what I really, I guess I commend the movie for is still showing us so much of the world while following this one character on this relatively simple journey, right?
No, I think so too. How did you feel in comparison to Westworld?
Um, I like Westworld more. I
Okay.
like Westworld more because I like. Don't get me wrong. Both of the movies are uncomfortably relevant. The planet is obviously there are problems, right? Um, we are not far from complete climate catastrophe, and that is horrifying. However, we are not. It also kind of shows you, watching this movie shows you how good things still are, you know? Whereas with Westworld, the message has gotten so relevant so quickly, you know, that I think it disturbed me and kind of riveted me a lot more than this movie did.
The relevance of this movie, I think it becomes more relevant with time. As bleak as it may seem, and for everything they didn't know, they still got a lot of things right. And maybe this is not what 2022 looks, but I could imagine, like, okay, maybe if someone made this movie today, I could believe that. It feels like someone in 2022 thinking, okay, maybe this is what 21, 22 will be like. It
Yeah.
definitely feels like the problems presented in this movie are not solved. And yeah, the point this movie makes of, like, if things continue, this is the result. Yeah, okay, I think that's still, these are all still relevant issues that the movie raises.
Yeah. No, I agree. Um, my hope is that we can still watch this in several years and find comfort in how still not relevant it is. But time will tell. Only time will tell. But I really like the movie. I enjoy it. I think it's really worth a watch. I think it's worth a watch if you're a science fiction fan, especially. Um, and with it streaming on HBO Max, it's much more accessible now. So if you have an HBO Max subscription, then there's no reason why you shouldn't just turn this on and watch it and check it out.
This movie is not a traditional sci-fi in the sense of, like, spaceships and futuristic technology. I don't know if there's almost any futuristic technology in this movie. It's the current world, but just derelict and in disrepair. And I think those kind of sci-fis are maybe better when they're paired with, like, extreme technology, but that's not the point of this movie. And I still love it. I still respect it, and I still really found myself engrossed in the world it was building. So I'd recommend anyone watching it, sci-fi fan or no, but also don't go into it expecting Star Wars.
Right, right. Which was not the exact mistake I made, but it was. I was expecting again a more sweeping look at this world. But I like the little journey it takes you on. It's great. This
Yeah,
is a good movie.
I agree. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for joining me, Adrian.
Thank you, buddy.
All right, and thank you everybody for listening. Soylent Green is people. Goodbye.